In this video, I'm going to talk about my initial manual scoring results for my baseline, model, text generations, given my evaluation prompts. So a quick recap, what have I done so far when it comes to my evals? I've defined scoring criteria, I have curated a set of eval prompts based on each scoring category, and then I've created a fast HTML app where I can perform my scoring activities. So what are the scoring categories? I have 6 scoring categories that I'm going to evaluate my models on or for. I have foundational language capabilities of grammar and context tracking, which is also called consistency in the TinyStories paper. I have 3 emergent capabilities that I would expect only larger models to show, which is factual knowledge, reasoning, and creativity. And then I have 1 story-related capability, which is plot. My goal was to generate prompts for evaluation that either isolate, in the case of factual knowledge, reasoning, and context tracking, or elicit opportunities to exhibit, for the case of plot and creativity, scoring categories. So I wanted to make the job easier first for myself and then use that as a proxy of making the job of the LLM judge easier to evaluate scoring categories in a focused way. So I have 3 models that I've chosen as my baseline because they're similar in size to the models that I'm going to be training in this project. And those 3 models are the TinyStories 1 million, 8 million, and 28 million. Those are the titles. Their parameter counts are different. And so this is the generation script that I'm using. Pretty standard. Just things I want to highlight is making sure the padding side is left so that we're not generating tokens based on padding tokens. Model.eval and torch nograd are things I always make sure to do so that it's somewhat deterministic when it's expected to be deterministic. I'm doing doSample equals false and numbeams equals 5 because that was published by the authors as their parameters for generation. And then I have a minimum and maximum length, which I'll talk about at the end about how I think that might change moving forward. And then everything else is pretty straightforward. I'm doing these generations in a batch, so I have to kind of iterate through them at the end. So this is what I'm using for generating text for 150 prompts for the 3 models. My current eval prompt set includes 150 total prompts, which includes 25 unique prompts for reasoning, 25 unique prompts for factual knowledge, 25 prompts each for context tracking, plot, and creativity, and there is some overlap between them, so there's some duplicates. 25 prompts for grammar, and those are intentionally duplicated, so I'm choosing 5 prompts from each of the other 5 categories. And so yeah, that's 150 total categories. This is the scoring app that I made with fast HTML. My last video was a walkthrough of that code, and it shows the progress bar or progress index at the top. It shows the category that I'm assessing, the prompt and the completion, previous next button, so I can iterate through the data set, and then I can click on the button that I'm evaluating, and then I can click on the score. There's no save or submit button, so it's always persistent every time this page renders, or anytime this renders, or anytime a button is clicked, it goes back to the CSV, and then when it renders, it reads the CSV and selects the button that corresponds to the score that's in the CSV. All right, so let's get into the scores. I had 6 categories, and across them there were 18 criteria. I am evaluating generations from 3 models on 150 prompts each. And the scores that I'm providing for each criteria are either 0, 0.5, and 1.0. I've taken this from the TinyStories paper. They didn't quite use it the same way that I'm using it, but they had this failure, partial success, success scoring levels for their factual reasoning and context tracking prompts. So I've taken that idea and I've applied it to all of my prompts here. So first of all, let's look at what was the average value across all categories, all criteria for each model. So this is, a maximum of 1.0 and a minimum of zero point 0.0. So as I would expect, as model size increases, the average score value increases. So the 1 million parameter model, which in this case has 3.7 million parameters, has an average score of 0.25. The 8 million parameter model, which is closer to 20 million parameters, has an average score of about 0.5. And the 28 million parameter model, which has about 60 million parameters, has an average score of 0.61. So I think this is really interesting just right off the bat. The significant increase between 25 and 50, so we're doubling our score and we're multiplying our parameters by 5 times. But then it's not nothing. It's still about what, zero point 0.1, which is, somewhere about 25% or so of an increase. But I'm going from 20 million to 60 million approximately, so I'm 3xing my parameter count, but I'm only getting a 25% increase, whereas here I 6x and I got a 2x increase. So actually, maybe that is proportional now that I'm thinking of it out loud. So perhaps my 120 million parameter model might be closer to a zero point 0.8, 0.9, but time will tell. So the next thing I wanted to look at was how are these models doing for each of the categories overall. So I've averaging scores for context tracking, and then looking at the 3 models and then doing that for all 6 categories. So some interesting things that I wanted to point out. The highest category by score for my 1 million parameter model is grammar by far, right? 0.6. That is, about 5 times, or I guess 3 times as large as any other category. So this is in line with what I read in the TinyStories paper, that grammar appears first as a capability. There's a big jump from my 4 million to 20 million, and then a tiny jump from the 20 million to the 60 million. So that was great to see. That makes sense. That validates my understanding from the TinyStories paper. The worst categories, even for the largest model that I tested, were creativity and factual knowledge. And creativity in particular was the lowest scoring. And this also tracks with the TinyStories paper because they had shown that creativity only really appears at, large hidden dimension sizes. And even then, the kind of maximum value of creativity, like the 8s and the 9s out of 10, was only available for models that were like GPT-4. So this is to be seen how this scales to 125 million parameters, but something to keep an eye on. And factual knowledge as well was significantly lower than the other 4 categories. So interesting, really cool to see that in action. And then the other kind of highlight I want to make is reasoning, right? So the reasoning score for the smallest model is 0.2. It doubles to 0.44, and then it goes up by another, 60, 70% to 0.7. And that's pretty solid, right? 7 out of 10. So if we were talking about school grades, I don't know what school grades are these days, but a 70% is passing. So that was really cool to see. Reasoning was stronger than factual knowledge. Now, this is not the most scientific process. I'm still figuring out what the scoring should look like and what the criteria should look like, but I feel pretty solid about the process that I followed. And so it is interesting to see some of these patterns emerge. So that's a high level. This is what it looks like per category across the models. In every case, there is an increase as we go from 1 to 8 to 28 million model name. In some cases, the jump comes later, such as for creativity. In most cases, the jump happens between the 4 million and 20 million parameter model. But in all cases, we see an increase, which makes sense, and that's a good check. Okay, so now let's look at each criteria for each category. So factual knowledge and reasoning only had one criteria. For factual knowledge, what was I assessing? I was assessing if the completion contains only correct factual information relevant to the prompt. For reasoning, I was assessing completion demonstrates correct logical reasoning relevant to the prompt. So that's pretty straightforward, and we already talked about the scores there. But just highlighting again that factual knowledge was significantly lower than the reasoning score. So the models are performing better with factual or with reasoning than with knowledge, general knowledge about the world. Creativity had 4 different criteria. Character, behavioral, and emotional responses are innovative. The completion contains unique details to the story world. The completion creates fresh situations. The completion offers unexpected or novel elements. This unexpected or novel elements, that was the highest scoring, and it was kind of the easiest bar to cross. And something that you'll see here, which, you know, could be because I'm still getting used to the scoring process, and this was my first time scoring, so there likely are errors in how I scored things. And if I thought about it a little more, I might score differently. But I think this is something that I've experienced with smaller models, which is that they are creative, often at the cost of plot, context tracking, and grammar. And so this doesn't surprise me too much that the unexpected or novel elements were introduced in the smaller model, because when I was judging this criteria, I was not thinking about anything else. I was not thinking about grammar. I was not thinking about context tracking or plot. I was just focused on creativity. So if an unexpected or novel element was introduced, whether or not it was contextual, whether or not it was grammatically correct, whether or not it fit with the plot, I gave it creativity points. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end, about the pros and cons of grading in such a manner. But overall, I found there to be more pros than cons for this approach. Other things to highlight: the innovative behavioral and emotional responses and fresh situations were non-existent for the smallest model. And unique details, so just it could be just small things like the shape of something or a detail about the timer when they were baking cookies, like small details that you would expect good writing to have. Those were very, very rare for the smallest model, and it definitely got to a 34% is not a great score, but it definitely improved from 2%. So, okay, I think that's everything I want to say on this page, this slide. Next, we go to our basic foundational language capabilities of grammar and context tracking. The age-appropriate vocabulary usage was the easiest to score. These models don't really generate anything that's not within the TinyStories dataset. And the vocab. There was one prompt where the model made up a couple words, and so that's where I docked points, and so that's why you have this weird dip for the largest model. Dialogue formatting and punctuation. My guess for this is that I was a bit stricter for grammar as the testing progressed. So that's probably just, user error or judge error for why it decreased. Other grammar categories or criteria: proper use of pronouns and reference, that increased, and that checks with what I was experiencing as I was grading. Sentence structure, logic, clarity, and completion. This was the biggest one. As you can see, the biggest jump from 0.14 to 0.62. And that was really evident. The small model had terrible structure, logic, clarity, and completion for the sentences. And the tense consistency throughout the completion also had a similar jump. And, lots of repetitive sentences and things like that for the smallest model. For context tracking, I was looking at 3 criteria. Completion, completion maintains complete coherence with prompt. It correctly references, tracks all objects, characters, and their attributes. That "and their attributes" is really important because without that, the scores would have increased for sure. And then maintains consistent narrative flow. So this was really interesting to see. The biggest jump is from 2% to 40% when it talks about maintaining a consistent narrative flow. The medium-sized models were definitely not perfect, but they were much better at following the narrative flow of the story. And for everything here, as we go left to right, It improves. The coherence with prompt has kind of peaked so far, and I would be interested to see what my eventually 125 million parameter model scores. And then the last category is our story-related capabilities, which is plot. And some things I want to highlight. Well, first, let me read the criteria. Conflicts are addressed rather than abandoned. The pacing is appropriate, not too rushed or dragging. The story has a clear beginning, middle, and end, appropriate to age level. The story maintains focus on the central conflict theme without random diversions. And so something that's interesting is the pacing I found to be the worst category across all, and this does check out with my experience as I was grading these stories. I just felt that they were just not right. It was just I didn't really get a sense that there was like a really well-paced story. Either it was dragging and repeating itself slightly, or it was like one sentence or two sentences, and it was very insufficient. Conflicts are addressed. We go from 0% to 42%. So the smallest model just abandoned conflicts that were in the premise and the prompt. And the other big jump is the focusing on the central theme. So the smallest to medium model had almost, like a 3x jump. And then there was still a considerable, 30% jump from the medium to large model. So that's a summary and also a deep dive of scores by category and scores by criteria for each category across these three models. I think the main takeaway for me is that very, very surprisingly and very, very cool to see that reasoning exists and factual knowledge exists, even for the smallest model. So if we go back to reasoning, 20%, that's not nothing, right? So I was really impressed that even the smallest model had some capability of reasoning. Factual knowledge, not as much, but still, I would expect 0%. So the fact that these are non-zero values for these small models is really mind-blowing to me. It's really exciting to me because there's potential, right? We can do something with this, and these are just pre-trained models. We haven't fine-tuned them. What can we do with this reasoning and this factual knowledge capability? That's what really excites me moving forward. Okay, so I'm going to now revisit the targets that I established. This was referenced from Figure 4 of the TinyStories paper, where they showed the different scores based on hidden dimension and number of layers. And so I matched that up with the three models that I'm testing. And they have a scores listed out of 10. So I just divided by 10. So it's normalized and similar to what I'm doing out of 1. And I'm just going to walk through each of these 4 categories that they have scores for. Starting with creativity, this was really interesting. I was expecting my assessment to be maybe a little lenient, but it turns out that that's not the case. My scores were significantly lower. The 28 million parameter, which is actually 60 million, so I have to keep saying that because it's confusing. 70% for creativity. Mine was 30%. So to me, that says, okay, maybe I'm being too harsh. That being said, it didn't feel that way when I was grading it. I thought I was being reasonable, and if anything, I thought I was being maybe a little too lenient. So let's see. I might have to change that criteria over the course of this project, or it just might turn out that for creativity, I have a strict judge. Next, we have grammar. This matched out pretty well, right? 61%, 59, 77, 82, 83, 86. That's awesome. That makes me feel good. The most common baseline capability matches between the targets and my, relatively rough evaluations. So thumbs up, that makes me feel good. Consistency, which is context tracking, similar to creativity. Turns out that my criteria or my judging is a lot stricter than the GPT-4 evaluator. The highest score was 90%, whereas mine was 63%. And I gotta be honest, I'm not too worried about this. I would much rather be stricter than not. So if I'm being too strict and the LLM judge ends up being a little more lenient, maybe I'll split the difference, and I'm okay with that. And finally, we have plot. And here the maximum kind of matched, 60% to 73. But then the medium sized and the small model scores are significantly different. Now, the most exciting elements, and I can't lie, these are the most exciting for me. Factual knowledge and reasoning were not quantitatively assessed in the TinyStories paper in the way that these other scores were listed. So I don't have reference points like this for my evaluation other than figures 9, 10, and 11, which is not nothing. So I'll definitely do a quick spot check of that. So factual knowledge and reasoning are without targets right now. And so excited to see, how that evolves over time. All right, so that is the meat of my presentation. Now I'm going to go through some observations of what I learned while I was manually scoring these 450 stories. So the first thing I noticed, which is not surprising, is that judging quality improves and changes over time. And over time, implicit judging criteria surfaces. So by the time I was doing the last set of 150 prompts and completions, I realized that I was a lot more definitive in what I was giving zeros to, what I was giving ones to, and what I was giving 0.5s to. I also think that's why the largest model has the strictest scores. And so in that sense, I would not be surprised to see the LLM judge scores be a little higher than what I scored, but we'll see. The phrasing of scoring criteria improved, and I will show exactly what that was like. And that was just something I learned, that it was hard for me to quite answer the question, and I wanted to be able to answer the question as fast as I could because there were 450 of these stories to get through. So I didn't want to spend too much time with, the cognitive load of trying to answer the question. I wanted a quick yes, no, maybe, and that would map to, 1, 0, and 0.5. I identified one duplicate prompt and replaced it. So the next round of generations will not have that duplicate prompt. And then I was aware of different pros and cons of isolating scoring categories. So when I was scoring context tracking, I was not scoring anything else, right? There could be terrible grammar, there could be a terrible plot, there could be zero creativity, but I didn't care. I was scoring context tracking and I was scoring those criteria. I found this more times than not, I found this very liberating because I could focus in just on the thing that I was scoring. Now, at the same time, the con towards this or for this approach is that language is very difficult to compartmentalize. So when you're reading story, it's hard to separate context tracking from creativity, from plot, from reasoning, from factual knowledge. There's a lot of distractions. If something's not factually correct, it's going to mess with your, it's going to distract you while you're assessing reasoning. And if the context tracking is not correct, it's going to mess with you when you try to evaluate the plot. That being said, 8 out of 10 times, I thought that this isolation of scoring categories benefited my approach. So I'm definitely going to stick with it moving forward. We'll see if the LLM judge feels the same way that I did. Cool. So with that being said, I want to show some examples that I thought were interesting and kind of give the experience of what it was like for me to score these stories. And then I'll also show the improvements I made to these scoring criteria. So we're going to look at 321, 320, 250, and 200. So if we go here and let's look at 321. So this one was the context tracking one, and I gave this 0.5s. So once upon a time, there was a little girl. Her name was Julia. So it's a little girl, her name is Julia. So those are already two things we have to context track. Every day, Julia helped her mom do the laundry. So she's helping her mom or mama, and what she's helping her is doing the laundry. And it was her favorite job, right? So there's a lot of context in there. She's helping her mom. She's helping her mom do laundry. She's helping her mom do laundry, and it was her favorite job. So this implies that she's done this before, she does it a lot, and it's her favorite thing. So I would assume that her mom also knows it's her favorite thing. So a lot of context already, just in that one and a half sentence. She loved to put the blank. And then the completion is dirty clothes in the washing machine. So far, so good, right? So I probably started this out at 1.0. Um, but then it started deviating, right? So then it said, one day Julia asked her mama, "Can I help with the laundry?" Mama smiled and said, "Yes, you can help. You can put the dirty clothes in the washing machine." So that doesn't make a lot of sense to me because we've already established that she helped her mom every day, right? Which I don't know why they're doing laundry every day, but anyway, I didn't. That's besides the point. So every day she's helping her mom do the laundry, and it was her favorite job. So one day, can I help with the laundry? I felt that that was not tracking context, so I bumped that down to 0. 0.5. Everything else after that um, is pretty standard, right? Yes, you can help. You can put the dirty clothes in the washing machine, so that tracks. Julia was so excited. That also tracks. It's her favorite job, and she loved to do it. She put all the dirty clothes in the washing machine. She watched as the clothes spun around and round. When the laundry was done, Mama said, "You did a great job, Julia." Julia was so proud of herself. She smiled and said, "I did it." Another one. That doesn't make any sense to me. I guess maybe there's like a childlike innocence that is in play, but if she's doing it every day and it's her favorite job, I don't know why she would be surprised that she did it and she would be proud of herself then say that I did it. So that made me feel like, okay, across the board, I feel like there are some issues. It's not 100% correct. It's not failing on all counts, but it's somewhere in the middle. And so somewhere in the middle is zero. 0.5. It's correctly referencing and tracking all the objects and characters, but not their attributes, right? So this is one of Juliet's attributes is that she's routinely doing this and it's her favorite job, and it's not tracking that. Maintains consistent narrative flow. No, because we're expecting all these kind of explicit and implicit things about Julia and laundry, and then it doesn't show up everywhere in the completion. So I thought this was a good example to show for how I process this scoring activity. So that's 321. Let's look at 320. One day, Timmy had a goal. He wanted to fit into his favorite toy car. He was very excited but grumpy too. He tried to fit into the car, but he was too big. So, okay, that makes sense. He wanted to fit into his car, but he's too big. So far, so good. I'm like, all right, we're starting this out at a 1.0. Timmy's mom saw him struggling and said, "Let me help you, Timmy." She helped him fit into the car. Timmy was so happy. So far, so good. A little bit, you could argue that this is probably not fitting the coherence of the prompt, but there's nothing in the prompt that said he did not, he like it was impossible to fit. It did say he tried to fit in the car, but he was too big. But okay, fine. His mom helped him fit in the car. He hugged his mom and said, "Thank you, Mommy." From that day on, Timmy tried his best to fit into his toy car. He learned that it's okay to ask for help when you need it, and he was never grumpy again. The end. And he was never grumpy again. That also, like, I saw that as a positive that the model remembered to put that in. And so I thought that was a plus sign, even though it's a little bit kind of random. Like, I don't know. It didn't really say why he was grumpy. So it makes sense that we're not explaining why he's not grumpy, but it seems like his lack of or his grumpiness is being resolved because, he's feeling better about fitting into his toy car. So overall, this was a pretty solid example. For the first two, I gave 1.0s because I feel like there was full success tracking all the objects, characters, and attributes, especially with the grumpy reference. That was really solid. And then in terms of consistent narrative flow, this one was, debatable, but something just felt off about this. Like, from that day on, Timmy tried his best to fit into his toy car. So that part didn't really make sense because if he was able to fit into the car and then he was very happy, why did he try his best? Like, why didn't he just figure out from his mom how to do it? And then if he didn't figure out how to do it, why was he never grumpy again, right? So if he's continuing to struggle, why was he never grumpy again? So I think there was some inconsistencies in how the narrative progressed. And so I gave it a point 0.5 because, it's not fully successful, it's not a failure at all, somewhere in between. So that's point 0.5. So this was another context tracking. So let's go to my favorite categories, which is reasoning and factual knowledge. So Lily likes cats and dogs. She asked her mom for a dog, and her mom said no. So instead, she asked her dad for a dog. Cool. That's all I'm looking for, pretty much. There's some other things, but that we'll get to. But she asked her mom. Mom said no, so let's ask her dad. The other kind of option could have been she asked her mom for a cat, or she asked her dad for a cat. All of those options I think would have been reasonable. And so I gave it a score of 1.0. Her dad said yes and gave her a dog. Lily was very happy and hugged the dog, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the hard part about reasoning and factual knowledge assessment was that when the model has these long completions, I wasn't really sure, how to address that. So I would read the whole thing, but then there was all this other business. Lily said okay and ran to the slide. She felt the wind in her hair and the sun on her face. You did it, Lily. So I tried not to let that influence my score unless there was something in here that contradicted the correct answer. So if somewhere down the road in the generation, the model said, she asked her mom for a dog and her mom said yes, then I would have given it zero point 0.5 because at least it mentioned it correctly once, but it didn't mention it correctly consistently, so I would have given it a zero point 0.5. But in this case, I let it slide. What I do think I want to do is, in the case of reasoning and factual knowledge, I want to remove the min_length parameter for model.generate because I don't want there to be a minimum generation length when the answer can be a few tokens. So that's something I definitely want to implement in my next iteration so that the model is not kind of forced to elongate the story when the answer is a few tokens. All right, so one more is index 200. And this is factual knowledge. Alice was so tired when she got back home, so she went to bed. Great, 1.0. She was so tired that she fell asleep right away. Still 1.0. When she woke up the next morning, she felt much better. Still 1.0. She was no longer tired and she was ready to play again. The end. Awesome. 1.0 all across the board. Nothing deviates from it. Completion contains only correct factual information relevant to the prompt. So that was an example of a very straightforward, to the point assessment. Now, you can see, like, if I was also scoring creativity and if I was also scoring plot, then you could see how that might dilute my assessment, or at least in my opinion, I would feel like it would be hard to keep track of what I'm scoring creativity, what I'm scoring plot, what I'm scoring factual knowledge. I could do it, but it might take 30 seconds instead of 10 seconds. And that additional cognitive load that I'm experiencing, I have to imagine that it's going to be experienced by the LLM judge. So my hope is that isolating prompts to dedicated categories, single categories, is going to kind of quote unquote ease the cognitive load of the LLM judge, just like it eases the cognitive load for me so that I can just focus on this, and make it a quick 1.0. Let's move on to the next one. And then I think there was one. Yeah, I think I'll do one more just to show creativity. Today was Leo's birthday. His friends came over with presents. When he opened the biggest box, he couldn't believe his eyes because it was full of presents. So okay, right off the bat, 0. That is, that's not unexpected. Leo was so excited that he started to jump up and down. So, that's not innovative behavioral or emotional responses. His friends laughed and said, Leo, you look so happy. Leo smiled and says, yes, I love presents. His friends gave him a big hug and said, happy birthday, Leo. Leo was so happy that he jumped up and down. He said, thank you, friends. This is the best birthday ever. His friends all laughed and said, you're welcome, Leo. We're so glad you like it. Leo smiled and said, I'm glad you like it too. And they all lived happily ever after. So, stress situations, no. Unique details? No. So I think, what could have saved the score a little bit is that if there were interesting details about the presents or about, maybe a friend's name or how they were, their facial expression or some kind of detail that, or a cake, birthday cake or birthday candles or, music playing or something that would indicate to me that there's a story world and the model is aware of the story world and is giving details that help kind of paint the picture of what the story world is. So I didn't see any of that. So this was an example of zero creativity. So I could do this on and on. There were definitely some tedious moments, but overall I really enjoyed evaluating these stories. As you can see, like there's so much information packed into these prompts. If we go back to our laundry one, I'm just a big fan of this laundry prompting completion because I feel like it's such a good example of how interesting context tracking is, and all of these categories are, but it's so interesting how we can, with a single sentence, every day Julia helped her mom do the laundry. It was her favorite job. Just with those two sentences, we have established so much context. And if the model doesn't continue that context and doesn't track it, it's relatively easy to give it a bad, and that's the correct score. So again, very excited. I feel a lot more comfortable assessing these stories, and this was just my first iteration, so it'll only improve as we move forward. Yeah, so I think that's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.